Welcome, everyone. This is a public lecture. I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, elders past and present, which this meeting takes place. My name is Dr. Tracy Beck-Fenwick. I'm the director of the Australian Centre for Federalism. The Australian Centre for Federalism was formed in 2012, actually, to re-establish ANU as a leading academic institution for the study of comparative federalism. Our current mandate is that the Centre aims to bring new debates to the study of federalism both in Australia and outside, framed within a fresh comparative approach. And for that reason, we've invited Dr. Mireille Paquet to talk to us tonight. Dr. Paquet is an assistant professor of political science at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. She is also the director of the Centre for Immigration Policy Evaluation. She's a leading expert in Canadian immigration politics and policies. Her current work, which is funded by the FQRC, focuses on the governance of immigration and integration policies in federal regimes, Canada, the US, and Australia. Mireille is also in Australia currently conducting research on public administration and immigration, and is especially interested in the role of public servants in the formulation of immigrant selection policy. She's also just published her first book in 2016 called La Federalisation de l'immigration au Canada, and it was published by l'Université de Montréal Press, and we hope it's going to be translated in English soon, so it can maybe have a even wider audience. And so I'd like to welcome Mireille to talk to us tonight. Thank you.
So thank you. It should be translated. We hope so. But it's always a challenge, especially to write your first book. If you're, this was my dissertation, obviously, and it's hard to, retranslate it by yourself because you just want to get it out. But there are some articles at the end of the talk which you can look at. So before starting, I just would like to thank Dr. Fenwick for hosting me at the center. It's been a real pleasure to be at ANU. Everybody's very welcoming, and the center is really an interesting place to think about federalism. And I really hope that it continues to foster this new comparative outlook on federal institution and federal dynamics, because I really think there's a lot of work to be done. So today my talk is entitled Canadian Provinces and the Federalization of Immigration. I was told that this was not a talk for academics, so I've kind of evacuated all the theory. However, should you want to have a theoretical discussion at the end, I will be more than happy to kind of bring back the theory in there, to talk about it. But we can still have a very interesting discussion, I think, about how immigration has changed in Canada in the last 20 years, and in what I document in my book in somehow a surprising way. And most importantly, especially for those of you that care about federalism, it has changed as a result of subnational pressures for national policy change, as opposed to more of a top-down or federal to sub-state unit dynamic of change. So this is what we're going to talk about today. But first, we're going to review the basics. So how many of you know anything about Canada? Oh, that's a pretty good audience. Okay, yeah, so we have several Canadians in the room, so I can't be as exotic as I've been, because I've been giving talks in Australia for a little while now, and everybody's like, yeah, we know nothing. And I'm like, awesome. Okay, so I'm still going to cover some basics to make sure we understand and we have an interesting conversation. So I'll first review quickly Canada's immigration regime, so kind of the basic core principle that animate and that structure also immigration governance in Canada. And you'll be interested to note that some areas make Canada very comparable to Australia, but some actually make Canada less comparable to Australia. Then we're going to talk about what I term the federalization of immigration in Canada. So the move from a national policy that is governed only by the federal government, so by Ottawa, which is our capital, to a national regime that is managed both by Ottawa and by all the provinces. So basically moving from one actor to 11 actors, and 11 actors that have a legitimacy in in the management of the national policy. But once again, we'll get back to that in a minute and have some example. And finally, if we have some time, we'll talk a little bit about some outcomes of this change, right? So I really show in my research that immigration in Canada can be thought of as a one government affair anymore, and that provinces do have interest and a say and want to have a say in the direction of national policy. But people often ask, well, is that actually affecting the life of people on the ground? And so I have some data stemming from other research showing that it does have some effect, but that the effect might not be as important as we think. However, the political effect of it and the kind of like democratic impact of these changes are very important. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So Canada, big country, lots of immigrants, right? So some data about 2015. So in 2015, Canada has welcomed over 200,000 new permanent residents, as well as a record number of temporary migrants. So this number has been increasing for the last 10 years. And just to give you an idea, this is Canada's population in 2015. We're in a phase that is called by most scholars in Canada, which is a phase called the consensus for high immigration levels. So now, every year, immigration levels keep rising in Canada, and these levels are not at all correlated with labor market conditions, right? So employment and immigration intakes are not correlated in Canada anymore. Government just keep increasing that number year after year. So this is the framework we're working with, and as you'll see in a minute, this is a framework, and this is kind of a general consensus that is backed generally by public opinion too. So we don't have a Pauline Hanson, do I say her name properly? Pauline Hanson in Canada, right? So we do have some people that are less comfortable with immigration, but we don't have a very strong anti-immigrant voice in national politics. So this consensus is not just an elite consensus, but it tends to be a generally spread consensus. Most of the people we welcome in Canada are economic migrants, so there are people that are selected based on, like in Australia, a skills system with points with regard to their work experience and qualifications. However, it's important to notice that this 63% also include the dependent of the people that are selected, right? So it's not just the one person, but it's also the children, the wives, and it could also be cousins or grandparents. So not all of the economic migrants are selected directly based on their skills. What might be more interesting for us, at least for me today, is to note that immigration is not at all spread out equally in the country. So people are pretty much free to go where they want to go. And where do they go? Toronto. Okay, so they go to Ontario, they go to first Ontario, and then they go to the biggest cities in the country. So Toronto, Ontario, and Montreal, with Alberta growing as a new destination for immigration, but this really is contingent on the economic conditions and the oil boom in the province, okay? But just keep in mind that basically, you know, we have some have provinces when it comes to immigration, and we have some have not provinces when it comes to immigration, and this is where it becomes really important. Just to give you an idea too, if you know Canada, this will not surprise you, but basically the country is empty, okay? And we're all like staying here, okay? So not only is immigration kind of, you know, not spread out equally in the country, but immigration is basically here and a little bit there, okay? So we still have a lot of room, so this is the overall population, but it's just to give you an idea of a bigger picture of where the country is at right now. Okay, so once again, general interest here. Some people ask me this question since I've arrived in Australia, so to be sure. We have pretty much similar source countries with some changes. So I think that the Philippines is not such an important source country in Australia, but apart from that, the source country of the immigrants that are coming in Canada as permanent residents are pretty much similar as the one coming into Australia. And maybe this is where things start to look a little bit different. When we think about how immigration is governed in Canada, we really can think of 4 sets of elements that, you know, are really structuring. So the first thing, we had this conversation earlier with one person in the audience. So in Canada, as opposed to Australia, immigration is a shared area of jurisdiction, right? So both the federal as well as provinces have the right to legislate on immigration-related matters. Naturalization, border control, these are federal matters, so these are only things that Ottawa can manage, but provinces technically are able to legislate in immigration-related issues. The historical pattern, though, after Confederation, so we had Confederation in 1867, has been one of federal dominance. So most provinces, with the exception of Quebec, and we can talk about Quebec in the Q&A, but this is a whole other bag of tricks, but most provinces were more than happy to let Ottawa lead in the establishment of what we consider to be the kind of contemporary regime of governing immigration. So the national immigration laws are all, done by the federal government. Provinces were happy to abide by it. We've never had, like it's been the case in the US, any kind of judicial contestation of the jurisdiction of the national government. There's never been even some conflict between the two laws. We also have an official multiculturalism policy and an official multiculturalism act that affect how immigration policies are managed. And we also have a Bill of Rights, which makes it a little bit different than what is going on here, especially because we have a freedom of movement or mobility right clause in the bill, which means that we can't actually force permanent resident to stay in a specific place in the country. So that kind of picture of that very empty map is partially due to that mobility clause. So within these structuring institutions, we also have policies that tend to be pretty much set and pretty much always the same since 1945. So high level of immigration, selected immigration too, so that's always what people tend to forget when they portray Canada as being so nice and so welcoming. We don't get boats. We don't get people who try to come in, right? So no Americans are trying to emigrate to Canada. We don't know yet. With Trump, it might change, but for now, we're pretty much trying to get people to come. We have snow, it's not the most exciting place. So high level of immigration, but, high level of selected immigration, which really support public opinion. Permanent settlement has always been the goal of Canada's immigration policy since 1945. So we've seen an increase in temporary migration, but, this really is going against the general goal of the policy. We have extremely generous government-funded settlement programs that do interact with Canada's Canada's welfare regime, right? So not only do we have immigrant-specific social programs, but we also have Medicare, we have very generous education policies, very generous employment policies also that do tend to be seen as generating great integration outcomes for immigrants. So this also supports what we see here is that in addition to those institutions and these policies, we have, generally speaking, as opposed to some other country, and once again, this is comparatively speaking, a pretty positive public opinion towards immigration, and we have a very strong narrative supported by all political parties with some nuances, right? So the past Conservative Party, current Liberal government, all supported this narrative about Canada being a settlement society, being an immigrant society, right? So we need immigrants, they're making us great. And so the government is very active in priming that consensus and priming that public opinion to make sure that people want to support immigration. So it's important to realize all of this just because it means that our politics is a pro-immigrant politics, which is very different than kind of a dynamic in which you can have parties that are against or pro-immigrant and that fight over who's going to control the discourse. Here, what is going on is that everybody is playing in this plane of, yes, we love immigrants, yes, we want to have more of them, but there's still a lot of politics going on within that sphere of pro-immigrant politics. So this is kind of where we're going to go. Other things that are important. So all of the things that we talked about earlier created considerable institutional and political constraint for change, right? And so my research generally is interested in contributing to, and I'm going to do that little theoretical moment here, but interested in knowing how institutions evolve in the absence of, actual real exogenous factor and actual real shock, right? So all this literature from historical institutionalism and all the new work from Mahoney, Tillen, Streck, and other people that are really interested in thinking about how institution would evolve in time. What is important to note also is that while the pattern historically has been one of provinces doing nothing and really kind of, letting the federal government doing the share of the work, at the same time, the immigrant experience on the ground is interacting very strongly with areas of jurisdiction that are subnational, that are provincial, right? So healthcare, education, employment, culture, all of these are provincial, are also funded by the provincial government. So in a way, provinces are picking up the cost of the immigrants that are selected by the national government. And as I said, despite all of this, the historical pattern has been one of passivity, right? So provinces really rejected any suggestion by the federal government that they could do anything with regard to immigration. They would go on the record to say it. They would not even answer requests by the federal government to provide input on immigration level. They'd just be like, no, we don't even want to touch this. This is dangerous. We want nothing to do with it. So in my book, which is in French, if you read French, you can read it. If not, you can wait for the translation. It has a beautiful Canadian symbol on. I'm very happy. It's like the new Society of Canada in the background. Beautiful cover, quite happy with it. So in my book, basically, I talk about how this kind of pattern of passivity from provinces and of activity by the federal government broke starting in the 1990s. What is important here to notice is that this pattern broke without all the things that I talked previously, that kind of pro-immigrant orientation, that very high level of immigration, of immigrants being selected. So this pattern broke without all the important principle supporting Canada's immigration policy changing. So it's kind of an internal change that happened. The people that make the policy have changed, but the policy itself has not changed. So that's really what I'm interested in. So that's my very poli-sci definition of the federalization of immigration, right? So the emergence of new institutional actor and or the modification to the status of actor who have a strong legitimacy inside an institutional or federal regime. So it's very boring, and I'm not going to read it again. But basically, we're moving from one government to 11 government, which means that basically stuff got complicated, okay? And I want to explain how is it that stuff got complicated. Because it's not because all of a sudden provinces became interested in immigration that, power dynamics didn't disappear, right? So Ottawa has been very active in the management of that immigration regime for years. So how is it that they, let that happen? How is it that they made their life very complicated by having to account for all these little provinces who, might have no experience, no capacity, and no real understanding of what immigration governance is about, So this is really what the book set out to explain, and I'm going to also kind of leave aside methodology elements, but just to let you know, I'm basically trying to reproduce the same field work I've done in Canada here in Australia by talking to elected officials, by talking to bureaucrats here, by talking to settlement providers, by doing some work in the archives, doing some work with the ANSARs, and basically conducting case studies for most subnational government to try to see if similar mechanisms are at play in each of the subnational units, and then to try to see how each subnational unit individually or collectively have been able to affect national policy. Okay, so if you want to talk about metas, we can also do it in the end. But generally, I speak to people, but I speak to a lot of people. It's very interesting, but very tiring. And then I try to kind of back that up with the archival thread, with the information also coming from official publication and other things, and to generally reconstruct a story that makes sense. Okay, so what does it look like, though, when I talk about provinces being interested in immigration and kind of moving away from passivity to activity, okay? In most countries, when subnational or local government become interested in immigration, It's to fight against immigration, right? So some of you might know what happened in Arizona in the last little while in the US, right? So state government passed ordinances to limit access to social rights or to general civic rights for people that might be targeted as immigrant or labeled as immigrants, right? So that's how we're thinking about this. But Canada kind of goes the other way. So what we see in provinces starting in the 1990s is the establishment of public administrations that are responsible for immigration. Out of the blue, all of a sudden, Nova Scotia, who receives like, I don't know, 200 immigrants, you know, most of them staying for like 2 days and moving, going to Toronto after, creates a Department of Immigration. What gives? What's going on, you know? We have government creating official and visible immigration policies. So once again, Prince Edward Island, you know, mostly known for Anne of Green Gables, you know, receives a lot of tourists, but not a lot of people want to move there to start a farm. Well, PEI now has an official PEI immigration policy. What gives? Okay, we see following this, and this is where it becomes really interesting, we see provinces gaining power over immigrant selection. And this is where it's interesting because it's not just Quebec. So for a long time, the pattern was that Quebec was able to select some of the immigrants because Quebec was really concerned about not getting enough French-speaking newcomers, right? But we don't have the same push in other provinces. The majority of the population doesn't speak French. So once again, what happens? And then provinces become, if I may, I know I'm recorded, but I'll still say it, a pain in the butt, in terms of intergovernmental relations. So all of a sudden they show up to meetings and they're being like demanding and they're like, we want to be consulted. This is not going to work. And so basically immigration becomes the same thing as, you know, tax point transfer, energy policy, environment policy, or any other kind of contentious intergovernmental area in Canadian politics. What happens here is that as a consequence, Ottawa becomes less and less able to act unilaterally when it comes to immigration policy. So the government used to be able to do basically what it wanted in Ottawa without really having to consult with provinces. Quebec was doing its little thing, and like as long as, you know, Quebec was not getting in trouble, then, you know, things were fine. So we move away from that system to a system where basically we have to have all this machinery of, you know, meetings monthly with officials, premiers, and, you know, all this handshaking. We have to manage the interests of provinces. We multiply at the same time the channel of entry to Canada. So Canada used to have one immigrant selection regime. It now has 12, you know, basically, or 11, depending on how you count, okay? So this can be seen as a good thing, or this can be seen as a bad thing. People have different opinions, but it is a fact that now there are more ways to enter Canada as there were before. And maybe, I mean, that's really interesting to me. It creates diversity within what we see as a Canadian immigration regime, right? So PEI as an immigration policy and tries to create those kind of immigrant settlement and integration policies. Are they really going to be the same as the one in Saskatchewan? Probably not. What are the implications of that, you know? And is this a good or a bad thing? There are different ways to answer this, but, you know, this is really what is going on. So the flagship indicator of this change has been the creation of the provincial nominee program, which is the equivalent of what is, well, not the equivalent, but is analog, let's say, to what is going on here with state-specific migration mechanism. So basically, it's a program that was established in 1998, and you might be interested to notice that, or to know that it's been created at the insistence of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Once again, kind of questioning our theories about why, you know, some national government would mobilize for immigration. I mean, Saskatchewan, you know, why? And so it started in 1998 and then got diffused to all provinces. And so outside of Quebec, all provinces have a provincial nominee program. This is the official definition by CIC or RCC. What is the new acronym?
IRCC.
Thank you very much.
Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada.
It's very...
Just changed that.
it's very hard to deal with this new change in name. It's very hard, yes. And so it's basically programs that allow provinces to select economic migrants based on their own criteria. And the criteria are generally defined by provinces, okay? So they're free to design the selection criteria in the stream. So they have economic streams, they have business streams, and in some cases they also have population focused streams. And most of the nomination by provinces are accepted by the federal government, right? So here, the federal government is not a veto player in terms of how provinces think about their selection. The way it worked, or the way it worked up until January, and it's starting to change, is that applicant would apply directly to their province of intended residence. The provincial government would issue a nomination, and then Ottawa would look at the application to make sure people were not sick, right? So TB, other type of disease, and that they were not war criminal, or, you know, things that we don't want to see, and then would issue permanent residence. So most of the cases that were rejected by the federal government were not contentious, and provinces were fine with it too. They didn't have the administrative capacity to actually assess the things Ottawa was rejecting on. In Canada, as I said before, because we have our Bill of Rights, these are not these are not programs that create residency criterion, right? So it's not because you apply to PEI to become a PEI permanent resident that you have to stay in PEI, right? So you can be very crafty and look at the fact that maybe PEI processes application a little faster than Ontario, for example, apply to PEI and then move to Toronto after the fact. And this program is not used to issue temporary visas, it's only used to issue permanent visas. So some provinces use the program as a way to have people in temporary condition move to permanent residence, but this is not the intended spirit of the program. Okay, so is this an important program? It depends who you ask, right? So orange line is economic migrants coming to the country overall, and blue line is the provincially selected migrants. Excluded from this is the Quebec selected migrants, right? So technically, if you added the people that are selected by the province of Quebec, you would probably get up to there, right? So each year, basically, provinces demand more PNP, more capacity to select immigrants, and Ottawa has to kind of cave, and it's starting to eat a little bit at, you know, its kind of margin to decide on its immigration level. But, you know, it's still not too bad. What is more impressive, though, is this. So this is a table, or a graph, or a figure, that basically shows you how much of provincially nominated migrants account for the share of immigrant in each provinces. And you can see that in some provinces, such as Newfoundland, PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, the provinces really changed the face of immigration in the province by basically being very proactive at selecting people. Okay, so in less traditional destination or have-not provinces, immigrant selection by provinces does change, you know, immigration. You can see that the only person that's not invited to the party is Ontario, because Ontario has nothing to do to get people, so they're just like, not even gonna bother, they're gonna come anyway. So they're more to actually, yeah, they really don't like the program. Okay, so in the book, basically what I try to address is how did this change happen? How did this occur in the absence of the usual drivers of change, right? So we have no social movement that was like, more immigrants, yay! We had no exogenous shock that called into question the overall orientation of the program, and we also had no federal pressures for decentralization. So it's not like if the federal government woke up one morning with their dear ex-Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, you know, being like, oh, we want to give provinces, you know, more power. So it's not, we can explain it that way. We can explain it using nationalism as an overall framework for explanation. So how else are we going to talk about this? So in the research, I basically identified two things going on. So there's kind of an overall political economy explanation to this, in which basically sub-state unit became very interested with immigration as a resource, right? So kind of moving away from the staple kind of way of thinking about how sub-state are justifying their existence to basically thinking of human resources as the new resource, and that kind of management of the human population and the labor force by sub-state government as a new way to legitimize the existence of the sub-state government. However, even before that, I went a little deeper and a little more micro in trying to explain how this happened. And a very interesting thing that came out of the explanation was that actually bureaucrats, my favorite people, the public servants, played a super important role in this. And it's not even a joke. I love public servants. We're going to go a little quicker. But basically, in all the provinces, starting in the 90s and maybe more around 1995, you have public servants, individuals that really acted as policy entrepreneurs within the public service. Most of these were actually in offices of economic development or offices of trade and innovation, some other cases in the office of, in the Department of Labor Force Management. But these people were really into immigration. They just loved it. They just thought it was the solution to all the problems, and they were like doing the job of policy entrepreneurs, right? So kind of building the capacity, building the thinking about it, and waiting, to make sure that, at some point there's going to be the right moment. And yes, they're going to be able to convince the premier, or they're going to be able to convince somebody else. It's interesting because we never think of bureaucrats as the main drivers of immigration politics, right? We think of them as implementation agents, but we don't necessarily think of them as innovators. And so the province, the cases from coast to coast really shows that this was extremely important. And so, as I said, often you have that single individual that's housed in a specific portfolio and that really believes in immigration as the magic bullet. And then people ask me always, well, why? Why are they so obsessed with it? There are three reasons. One of them is that we do have a lot of mobility between order of government and the public administration in Canada. So you actually have a lot of people that were at the Department of Immigration that have moved to subnational units and started work in these administration. And that basically had the experience of how you can leverage immigration as a tool for economic development or for capital attraction or for labor force management. And so they thought, well, we should actually import this, but the conditions are not there yet in the subnational government. You also have a lot of people that made a move from the settlement or immigration sector in civil society and then move into the public service of the province that once again brought that ideas. And then you actually have, over time, people that move from province to province. So you can really kind of follow a policy community across Canada of people that moved, let's say, from the Office of Immigration in BC that was created before the one in another province and just kind of brought the idea. So you really have to follow these public servants to understand how the base condition for the mobilization of provinces in Canada starts to happen. So I have some quotes here. It's my public servant saving the day in the province. And so, just some people telling us basically that, I did it. It's me and my supervisor. We brought it up. Obviously, I don't take this for face value. There's a lot of triangulation to make sure that this is true. But, you can really follow these people. Elected officials didn't care about it. So we worked really hard in the background to create that tiny unit and keep it alive up until a point where, there was some kind of interest. Same here, we had to be proactive. You had to really fight to get some time on the agenda of the minister and to really try to make the case that this is how the province was going to answer the new challenges that it's facing. And in the book, I really talk about these new challenges and the alignment of the Canadian economy and how provinces are, managing new challenges and all of that. But we're going to leave this aside. But really, these people that are not... they're politicized, but in Canada, they're much less politicized. And in Australia, these public servants, there's people that really believe in this file as something that, could help the province. So that's one of the element. And the other one is basically a classical political elite mobilization at the sub-state level, in which you basically have elected officials buying into the bureaucratic project and really identifying immigration as the new resource for their government. And so in most provinces, mid-90s in Canada, you have huge partisan shifts. So you have huge legacies of government, so 10 years of Conservative Party, 10 years of Liberal Party, or even NDP Party, which is kind of our center-left party in Canada, moving away, and so new legacies of government starting. And most of these incoming government did not at all campaign on immigration, right? So immigration is completely absent from all campaigns prior to 1996 in all provinces, even in Quebec. So Quebec talked about it a little bit under the Lévesque era, but then after that, it's completely absent. So no immigration talk, but nonetheless, once in powers, these new government really started to talk about immigration all of a sudden. And interviews really kind of point to the fact that there were these meetings with these very insistent public servants that were like, yo, Premier, I need to tell you how you're going to fix this deficit. I need to tell you how you're going to fix this problem with, the labor market and things like that. So all of a sudden, immigration appear in the discourse of the elected officials, but really the premiers and the ministers, not the backbenchers, really, really, really the executive, as immigration appear as a solution to either the economic development problems, the population problems, or the labor market problems. Oh, as well as the diminution of federal transfer. What's important to note is that in provinces, all of them, this movement happened in isolation from what we call the usual immigration policy community. So the settlement sector, all these people that were basically serving the immigrant population in a province, that knew about the challenges related to immigration, were not consulted. They were not even considered. So all of a sudden, the premier of a province would be like, I have this beautiful immigration strategy. And then the settlement actors would be like, yeah, and we've been providing services for years, so we could have talked, So it's very interesting because it creates all of a sudden a dualization, almost two policy monopoly in the province of, the people that are active in serving the immigrants versus the government that is active in defining immigration as a solution to all the problems. A couple of examples of how this looks like in practice. So this is the past Minister of Immigration in Ontario, who has questionable hair. And I put him here because we don't have all very good hair in Canada. I just wanted to make sure. So this was my best joke of the talk. So okay. So basically, Ontario, immigration is Ontario's lifeblood. This is the kind of discourse we see across the country. So we need it, if we want to, if we want to grow, if we want to, have a steady economy, we need all these immigrants. Okay, so really a call for more immigrants and a call for immigrants to be considered as a central resource for the economy of the society. Here, coming with this, and this is a little bit earlier, but we have basically premiers being very clear about the fact that for provinces to be able to leverage that resource, to be able to use that resource, the province need an actual, selection tool and some actual formal agreement for immigrant selection. So this is in 1993, long time ago, in Manitoba, which received less than 3% of the immigration at that point. Okay, and saying that, we're not going to have an opportunity to get a greater share of immigrants if we only rely on the national government. The national government is not really understanding our economic condition, our labor market. We're not going to have an opportunity to get a greater share of independent immigrants who may have the skills that we need for particular growth and development in areas of our economies. And so basically the solution is to get an agreement. And then we're going to keep petitioning the national government to get that agreement. And this is my favorite one. So the previous premier of Alberta, Ed Stelmach, and you might know that Alberta is basically a petrostate, right? So it's a government that relies on national resources to be able to sustain its economy, telling us in 2006 that getting some recognition of provincial jurisdiction over immigration and some tools for the management of immigration could be as fundamental to Alberta's future prosperity as the affirmation of the constitutional responsibility over natural resources. So really, very symbolic parallels being done between natural resources and immigration. And this you can see across the country. So in all provinces, with some differences associated with, the party system in provinces, but generally the same kind of things are at play. So what happens? What is the process of federalization, though? So basically you have this, right, that I've talked about a little more tonight. So growing provincial elite mobilization that is supported by a prior bureaucratic activism, which then, lead to a real process of capacity building in sub-state, in subnational states. So you have, the creation of those public administration, the investment of resources, and then at the same time, provinces start demanding more things from the federal government. But instead of being just like random provinces asking things, you now have a huge, architecture, a huge group of people and a lot of knowledge behind these demands, right? So they have to be taken seriously by the national government, which then leads, and then we could talk about how these arrows actually, creates pressure, but we're not going to do it tonight. But federal policy change in federal practices, but also the presence of provinces in national policy debate. Okay? So this is basically what happened between 2000 and 2010. Why is this important? Right? Apart from the fact that it gives me the great joy of coming to Australia. Well, so I think it's important because first off, this was an elite mobilization that is completely detached from the reality of immigration on the ground, right? So the result of this has been in a lot of cases policies that do not at all cater to the groups that are targeted by the policies, right? So there's been a growing disconnect between, the policies created by provinces and the immigrants that are coming into the province, which is generated a lot of tension, So that's the first thing, to really be able to understand the politics of it and the condition of contemporary immigration in Canada. We need to understand this. The second thing that is important is that this story helps us understand why is it that in all provinces, with the exception of Quebec, immigration is housed in economic development or economic type department as opposed to social policy development or education departments or things like that, right? So why is this orientation so economic? Some people could say neoliberalism, blah 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 blah, or we could just say, well, the bureaucrats were really the one pushing this and they were really interested in generating their own little universe in the provincial public service. And maybe more importantly, is that this change is the change that happened as a result of federal coercion, right? So Ottawa never gladly or never with joy provided provinces with selection powers and more, power over national policy. Ottawa was forced to do so, and so Ottawa is still resisting this very much, and they don't like this. So the relation remained extremely tense between order of government, with provinces wanting more and more, and with Ottawa being like, I'm really not sure this is a great idea, and you're tying my hands more and more. So without understanding this or thinking that, this was really something that came from the federal government, we're unable to read actual intergovernmental relation and immigration. Okay, some outcomes super quickly. So people are not living in the same place anymore. Immigrants are not going to the same place as they used to prior to the process of federalization. So immigrants are not going as much to Ontario as they used to, but this is very misleading because we had a major, set of pull factor in Alberta with the amount of jobs that we're creating around, the whole oil boom period. So we really can't necessarily say that this, change in the pie chart and the distribution of immigration is the result of provinces becoming more active, at least not when it comes to the diminution of the number of people that land in Ontario. But what we can see is that the have-not provinces, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Atlantic provinces, are seeing a change in their immigration intake. So that we know for, not entirely sure, but a little more certainty that this is the result of state action. Okay? I think maybe we're going to skip this, and we're going to skip this too. So it has some effect, but we're not entirely yet certain of what are the effect. I had promised a picture of the new Prime Minister, and because I'm an immigration scholar, I've added the Minister of Immigration just to make it very balanced. And so looking forward, so immigration is now federalized. Okay, so you can't think of immigration in Canada without thinking of federal and provincial. So you can't just think of the Department of Immigration, you have to think of the provinces. Now, looking forward, what is going to happen, right? So the first thing that's important to know is that Canada has basically copied the new immigrant selection system of Australia. So the expression of interest system that you now have in Australia has been implemented in Canada in January of this year. And so we're still waiting to see a little bit the impact of this, but this will affect provinces. And we're actually running a study right now looking at how provinces are reacting to the implementation of this system. So, maybe Tracy can re-invite me and I can tell you more about this, but suffice to say, changes are happening. Provinces are demanding more and more, so you have the maintenance of these demands. In 2010, the then government of Ontario starting to demand devolution of immigrant selection power. So if you remember that pie chart I showed you, so Ontario gets almost half of the newcomers in the country. So for all of a sudden for the province to get similar power as those of Quebec and to independently select the immigrants would completely change the face of the country. This won't happen, okay, so no question. But the fact that the government is demanding it gives you an idea of the kind of stake they feel they have on the immigration file and how active they are. And then finally, and that's always when I want to close my talk when I come to Australia right now, because everybody's very happy about Canada and the Syrian coming in, and we've had a huge intake of Syrian refugees, which we're all very proud of. But more and more we're getting some news from the ground that this settlement experience is very complicated, most of it because we had a lot of privately sponsored refugees coming in, and a lot of communities were not necessarily super well equipped to deal with the needs of these communities. So this is starting to create tension. So this could be seen as an experience that could actually kind of crack a little bit that great public opinion bubble we had and this kind of pro-immigrant consensus. And so how are these things going to play in the next 10 years remain to be seen. We haven't seen such a huge movement of people coming in the country under these conditions in a long time. So, this whole pro-immigration politics could be called into question, and would provinces necessarily remain so invested in immigration if public opinion was to shift? It's a question, but I think we can probably think that no. So once again, right, maybe things will change in the next while, and that's it for me. So thank you very much. I have some paper in English if you want to read now. Yes, thank you. So maybe I'll answer. Yeah. Okay, so that's a great question. So yeah, all provinces, they don't all have agents because that's not how a lot of countries function anymore. But what they do is that they try to cater to immigration agents, so the people that help people apply to countries. So they make sure to give them as much information as possible and to sell them, Saskatchewan, easy to get a visa, best option for you. So that's one of the things they do. So they're very, very active in targeting these these actors. Another thing they do is that they do go to those immigration salons now. So there's a big one that happens around the world, including in Australia, called Emigrate. And it's basically like a, you know, like the, do you have a salon de l'auto ici? like a it's like a car show. It's like an annual car show, and then people are like, yeah, come to New Zealand, or come to Saskatchewan. So they're very active in there, and they do have, you know, a lot of websites and a lot of online publications too. But no, they're very, very active in trying to convince people to go. Very much. Generally speaking, I should have been more precise. So I do mean no exogenous shock based on, you know, the immigration policy field. So the overall, basically you had no, you know, attacks, or you had no terrorist plots, or you had no kind of like shift overall in that. So all these moments, right, are accounted for in the book. So all the things you've talked about, including Meech Lake too, right? So you can't understand the story without understanding Meech Lake. However, to me, these aren't very much on the background. They're kind of like the overall. I know. It's a 20-year period. So they're kind of on the background, creating the, you know, leading condition for the mobilization of these actors. So I kind of take a province-centered approach here, and so, but we can agree to disagree. I mean, you could frame it, you could think about it as a policy transfer example. However, to me, I think policy transfer happens all the time. And so that's not really like, you know, in the work of bureaucrats, this is just happening all the time. What's interesting is how is it that all of a sudden that was the single thing that they were really interested in, and they, you know, used that file, and they, you know, remained stuck on that file. So some of them have, you know, like done some transfers, some of them have done some policy learning, some of them, so, you know, all of this could be also included in an explanation, but it's not really thinking about like just, you know, provinces copying one another, or provinces, you know, or diffusing policies, but it really is, why is it that these individuals were really kind of like, you know, attached to this file, and how is it that once they've learned or once they've transferred, they're actually, you know, petitioning and selling that ideas to people around them. So yeah, and that's what makes the case really interesting to compare, actually, the two countries, because we don't have that kind of, so we had some of those interest groups, you know, in some provinces. So a lot of meat packers, actually, that wanted to get people, a lot of people in the sewing industry, to manufacturing, the last remnant of like, you know, Canada's apparel industry, which, you know, surprisingly still existed in the 1990s. So some of these were present, but they actually were, you know, once again, kind of almost primed by the public servant to get active on the immigration file. And we didn't have those anti-immigrant interests playing. And so, yeah, that really, really changes the story between the two countries. So a big way that was uncovered in the talk, in which provinces have mobilized, has been to like A, demand more selection power, but at the same time B, get a recognition by the federal government of the cost associated with immigration on their areas of jurisdiction, right? So to say, like, for example, we get X amount of immigrants, and so we have to provide them English training in school. However, this was done not necessarily in a way, you know, to say we want less immigrants. You know, so it's like, no, we want to keep those immigrants, but we want to get more money. Okay, so and so in practice, what happens is that Ottawa funds a settlement program for newcomers. So that covers the first 3 years of establishment in the country, and that's really very much like, you know, access to you know, somebody to help you find an apartment, you know, basic language training and things like that. But after 3 years, they're off, and it's provinces, right? And so. I mean, for a lot of people I talk to, and even if you look in the media and everywhere, provinces seem to think that because immigration is selected, the costs remain low enough that it's not worth, you know, apart from just like complaining a little bit to the federal government and getting this recognized, the cost is not big enough to argue for less immigrants or to argue for less, you know, less power. So they prefer to get more people and then deal with the consequences later, because they do buy into this theory that just more people will generate more money. Okay, so that's the, you know, that's the kind of paradigm everybody is operating into. So that would be my answer here, but it is, you know, the costs are covered by both. And the other problem really, which we haven't talked about, is that, people move from one province to another, right? So in some cases, people are selected by, let's say, Manitoba. They stay in Manitoba for 3 years. Their services in Manitoba are covered by the federal government, and then they move to Ontario. And then Ontario is like, well, that was great. Like, now we have to, help this person settle in a new province, and we get no money. But it still hasn't reached kind of it is called federalism, right? But it hasn't reached a level in which it's so contentious, but it would have, I think, the potential, especially if we had more, I guess if we had more Alberta in Canada, it would become a major major problem. Yes. Okay. And then why would other provinces? But basically here we're talking about Ontario, because the only half province in this game is Ontario. And so Ontario was really kind of the laggard in this movement, right? So in the book, you see that Ontario was kind of the last one to really start to be interested. And part of it was really in the case of Ontario that at some point, you had kind of this change in the selection system, in the way the point system was managed in Canada, as partially a reaction to provincial mobilization and the rise of PNP, right? So remember that kind of chart I showed you in which the PNP grew and the economic program kind of stayed the same. And so as a response to that, Ottawa changed some of the criteria for selection. There were small regulatory change, right? They still remain in the spirit of the program and all of that. But that really affected the kind of people Ontario got all of a sudden, because they were the people that benefited from the national immigration policy. And when that stopped working for them, all of a sudden, then they became interested. And then the bureaucrats were like, whoa, we really need to do something. A lot of these actually were, in the case of Ontario, kind of people that had been dormant since, I don't know if you know anything about Ontario politics, but since the pre-Mike Harris era. So people that were kind of at the end of their career and were really kind of trying to make a last move before retiring. In 1867, the Constitution set up immigration to be responsible by both order of government. And then what happened is that provinces did nothing for years. And what's interesting is that all of a sudden they decide to actually act on this area of jurisdiction for which they have decided to do nothing prior to that. The professional orders of engineers, doctors, they're creating problems for people to practice in the country, that's for sure. So that's kind of the way they're making their kind of protectionism seen, is by making it very hard to get your license to practice in the country. But they're certainly not going to go and petition the government to get less people based on their medical or engineering skills. Not at all. It's a very non-popular thing to do. If they were known to do that, it would be very, very, very problematic for them in relation to public opinion.
So on that
Yes.
note, I want to thank Mireille, and we can keep talking. I know there was more questions, and I'd like to thank you very much for a great talk. Thank you for coming.